Stay calm. What's the procedure, everyone? What's the procedure? Stay calm. Wait. Everybody, calm down. No, Michael, no.
Oh my God, what's happening to me? Pubertal timing and its effect on academic performance is the title of our paper this afternoon. Hello, everybody. This is Jimmy Watson, Evie, Kenney, DJ, Needham, and Gabby, Silva. And today we're going to talk to you about adolescent development and the timing of puberty's effect on a range of different topics, whether it be academic performance, the context surrounding puberty and its timing, the behavior kind of ramifications to pubertal timing, and then also implementations in the classroom. So this is kind of what we're going to study today. And I think in order to kind of look at this important stage of development in students' lives, it's important to first look at a list of terms and kind of get a well-rounded definition of those terms before we get into the nitty-gritty of the individual topics. So in defining the terms, we kind of picked out 4 specific terms that we thought were absolutely incremental in understanding what we talked about in our paper and what we will talk about in our presentation today. So we looked at childhood, adolescence, puberty or pubertal maturation, and pubertal timing. Now, childhood and adolescence both provide a sort of timeline for our overall discussion, and it's important to recognize this timeline because we're going to use a lot of these words throughout our presentation. So childhood basically is just the time period leading up to puberty. It's from birth to puberty. There aren't concrete ages because obviously, as you all know, puberty can happen at different stages, and that's going to be very present to you throughout our entire presentation. Adolescence, on the other hand, is the time period during puberty. So that takes place from the onset of puberty until the end of puberty. Right? And then you will eventually be kind of a quasi-adult after that adolescence. But this adolescent period and the timing of the transition between childhood and adolescence is really what we're going to focus on today. And it's important in understanding those timelines going forward. The third term or terms is puberty and pubertal maturation. This is defined as a normative developmental process involving biological, psychological, and social mechanisms. So puberty is something everyone obviously goes through, and it is a time of immense change both physically and psychologically and socially in a student's lives. And the focus of our paper brings us to this 4th term, pubertal timing, and this is just when that happens. When is this maturation going to occur and this immense period of change going to occur in our students' lives? So now that we've defined those terms, if we look at kind of the next topic on our agenda, we were very interested to figure out what PT's or pubertal timing, PT's effect on academic performance was. That was one of the aspects of our project that really interested us a lot. And this paper by Torvik, who is a psychologist, and all of his colleagues looked at the effect of early puberty on academic achievements between girls and boys. And what was really interesting about this specific study is it looked at twins because biologically twins are going to be very, very, very similar. Obviously, they're twins, but looked at whether or not the timing of puberty affected their grades and test scores throughout high school. So it sought to answer the question, is timing associated with academic performance? And the kind of hypothesis that this paper uses is that boys, generally speaking, have lower academic achievement than girls. So the question was whether or not timing had an impact on the assertion that boys have lower academic performances. So they took 16-year-old twins. Now, 16 years old probably accounts for the fact that puberty is probably already jump-started. It's very rare that you'll find a 16-year-old who has not already begun puberty. And these 16-year-olds, there were 13,477. And what they did was they tracked the timing when puberty started. So that could be a growth spurt. It could be menstruation. And what they found was that over half of the academic differences between the sexes was associated with the differences in the timing of puberty. So one conclusion that the paper makes is that testing students who are not fully mature is not an accurate representation of academic achievement. So if you go back to the question I had asked you, or the question that they were answering before of boys have lower academic achievement than girls, that's kind of an odd assertion to make, considering that this paper eventually combats that statement with saying that, well, we actually might not be testing students at the appropriate time just because not all of them may have achieved full maturity from a puberty standpoint. So what this paper found was that pubertal timing's effect is great, and definitely has the most effect when someone is going through puberty early in their development.
The role context can play on pubertal timing. In the article, The Associations Among Racial Discrimination, Pubertal Timing, Neighborhoods, and Mental Health Among U.S. Mexican Boys, Seaton et al. Discuss the role that context can play in the lives of U.S. Mexican boys, highlighting racial discrimination, pubertal timing, and the role and effect of segregated neighborhoods. So when thinking about the role context can play on pubertal timing, it's essential to understand that adolescent development doesn't happen in a vacuum, but rather at an intersection of contexts, and understanding those contexts will allow us to better serve our students. The article found that higher exposure to peer racial discrimination and residential segregation during late childhood predicts earlier pubertal timing, and in turn increases in internalizing symptoms. They also found that racialized stressors may lead to advanced biological aging during adolescence and to subsequent health deterioration. The article discussed the weathering hypothesis in depth. The weathering hypothesis is when marginalized individuals experience both accelerated biological aging and health deterioration as a consequence of living in a society that unjustly burdens them. Essentially, racism and related social advantages during late childhood predicted accelerated aging in the forms of early pubertal timing and have implications for diminished mental health. So when thinking about how this can impact our students, we need to think about how the roles of things outside of our control and unjust situations, discrimination, etc., can play on their lives, how that in turn is internalized in their bodies and the way their bodies develop, and then how that impacts their mental health and their capacity to behave and their capacity to exist in the classroom. So when thinking about how pubertal timing impacts the student, it's really important to think about all the contexts that play into that and how that can be played out in the class. The effects of pubertal timing on body image, school behavior, and deviance. So in the article, The Effects of Pubertal Timing on Body Image, School Behavior, and Deviance by Duncan et al., they conducted a study to look more closely at the effects of pubertal timing on various aspects. They found that normal development process is viewed as positive by males, but is viewed negatively by females. Male early maturers were happy with their bodies, which means they were satisfied with their height and their weight, while female early maturers were unhappy with their bodies, meaning their height and their weight. This impacted the female early maturer's confidence, which in turn impacts the way in which they interact in a classroom. They also found that male early maturers exhibited defiant behavior more frequently than their female peers. So to learn more about deviant behavior and defiant behavior, they asked students a set of 3 questions and then asked administration 2 questions about said student. The questions asked were: how many times have you had anything to do with police, sheriff, or juvenile officers for something you did or they thought you did? Students were given the option once, twice, more than twice, or never. Question 2, how many times have you run away from home? The students were given the option once, more than once, or never. And then the third and final question asked to students was, how old were you when you smoked for the first time? And they either responded with never or with the age that they were. Then the 2 questions asked to administration or a member of the school were, has a student been absent from school an unusual number of days during the most recently concluded school year, to which they responded yes or no. And then how frequently is any specific disciplinary action required for the student? A, frequently, B, occasionally, C, never. These results were then studied, and each student was given a score, and then those scores were aggregated. It was found that for early maturing boys, regardless of socioeconomic status, regardless of low, middle, or high status, all of them had a higher score, indicating higher likelihood of deviant behavior.
We also looked at a study that focused specifically on pubertal timing in boys. Previous research on pubertal timing in boys had associated an early onset of puberty with purely positive outcomes for the boy, such as his peers look up to him because he is bigger, athletic, his voice is deeper, and from this he has greater confidence in himself and his body image. This is contrasted with the largely negative impact of early pubertal onset for girls. Mendel and Ferraro push back on this a bit and say that the impact of early pubertal timing for boys is actually more complex than people thought. Early onset of puberty, they show, can increase behaviors associated with delinquency. One quote that we found particularly interesting was that early maturing boys seem to have easier access to and utilize a greater number of social and commercial sources to acquire alcohol, perhaps due to their older seeming physical appearance. In addition, various other researchers found that frequent drunkenness and daily smoking were more common among those who perceive themselves as early maturers, consistent with the idea that imitating adult behaviors may be a normative response to the gap between social and biological maturation. And so these boys are feeling this intense difference between their biological maturation and this sort of lack of social maturation. So the difference in maturity, Mendel and Ferraro say, is leading them to engage in delinquency or behaviors that we would associate with delinquency. In another article, we found that while researchers predicted that deviance in either direction, in other words, either early or late pubertal timing, increases the likelihood of delinquencies, studies generally show that children who go through puberty earlier than their peers are at higher risks of delinquency. In a 2020 article titled Pubertal Timing and the Adolescent Delinquency, Rebecca Bucci and Jeremy Staff find that there are three main reasons, changes, really, that are happening during puberty for this heightened risk. The first is change in parental supervision. When a child goes through puberty, parents grant the adolescent greater levels of freedom, which in turn can allow the adolescent to engage in acts we would associate with teen delinquency: drinking, smoking, getting in trouble with the law, etc. When a child goes through puberty early, these freedoms are granted earlier, while their self-regulating capacities remain rather low. The second change is peer groups. Early developers have been found to have older and more deviant peers than their on-time and late peers, whereas late developing youth may be partly shielded from the delinquent groups as a result of their childish appearance. And thirdly, this increased risk in delinquency is caused by changes in negative body image perceptions. Delinquency can be a response to stress or anger or frustration, and a way that they attempt to relieve this stress and increasing self-worth.
So as Evie mentioned just a little bit ago, abnormal timing of puberty does, in fact, negatively impact both boys and girls, but the timing of those impacts are a little bit different. The research shows that girls are more negatively impacted when their puberty comes on earlier than normal, whereas boys are more negatively impacted if they hit puberty later or even a little bit later than normal. And they found that early adversity in life can impact pubertal timing. So Michelson, Rosa, and Van Marley specifically studied girls. And they found that if girls experienced some sort of traumatic experience as a child, and the two examples they brought up were either A, negligence from their father, or B, abuse from one or two of parents, a lot of those girls studied found that they experienced puberty at a much earlier age than normal. And that leads us into what's called the accentuation theory. And these authors found that the accentuation theory holds true for many of these girls that were studied. So the accentuation theory, just to give you a little quote here, they say, quote, transitional stress at puberty onset tends to accentuate previous emotional and behavioral difficulties. So it's kind of a little bit of a doom cycle here. So if you have some sort of emotional trauma that happens when you are young, oftentimes puberty comes on a bit earlier. But the accentuation theory says, well, when puberty comes on earlier, that brings up more emotional and behavioral trauma from the past. So it's kind of a vicious cycle that some kids, unfortunately, cannot necessarily gain a hold of. They went on to show, too, that cortisol reactivity is highest in premature pubertal girls and late timing boys. And that cortisol reactivity was linked with hyperactive thoughts having to do with fear, punishment sensitivity, and behavioral inhibition. So when boys and girls both had abnormal timings to their puberty, girls being early, boys being late, they oftentimes experienced higher amounts of fear, higher amounts of paranoia, more behavioral inhibition than their counterparts who experienced puberty at normal timing. And lastly, they found that higher amounts of testosterone were positively associated with oppositional defiant disorder, ODD. So boys specifically, when they go through puberty, they generate much, much more testosterone than their prepubescent days. And when they generate more of that testosterone, they, on average, in general, become a little bit more defiant than how they were before puberty. So that can even be a problem. We talked a lot about boys going through puberty later, but if they go through puberty earlier than normal, they might not have as many insecure thoughts, or their cortisol reactivity might not be as high with their fear and their paranoia, but they might be more defiant than others. So it doesn't necessarily matter if it's early or late. There are cons to both, but if an adolescent goes through puberty at an abnormal time, there's usually going to be some sort of side effects that we are going to see as teachers in the classroom. So going on a little bit here, we're going to talk about the implementations. Another paper talked a lot about trauma during your childhood, and they mentioned that a traumatic childhood can be counteracted and offset by a supportive and loving adolescence. And what it said was, and here's another quote, a child's HPA system is more likely to recalibrate itself and mitigate some of those adverse effects from infancy if they were given supportive and loving conditions through puberty. So your HPA system, that's a big, long scientific word, but essentially the HPA system is the center of the brain that plays an important role in the body's response to stress. So this research found that if a child has a very traumatic childhood, again, whether it's abuse, whether it's neglect, whether they were in a foster care, whether they were incarcerated even as a kid, if they have a loving, caring, supportive adolescent stage when they're going through puberty, oftentimes that can recalibrate their HPA axis, resulting in increased cortisol production, similar to that of peers who did not experience the same level of early life stress. So what that's saying is if you have a loving and caring, supportive adolescence, even if you had a very stormy and very difficult childhood, that loving and caring adolescence can do great wonders, and it can offset a child to the point where it can pretty much erase some of those bad memories. Not saying that always happens, but it's more likely to happen. So as middle school and high school teachers, specifically, because that's when a lot of these children are going through their adolescence, that's important for us to keep in mind, because we play an extremely crucial role in fostering those loving environments. Because yes, supportive and caring and loving experiences in childhood are super, super important, and they're very beneficial. But the research found that supportive and loving and caring experiences in adolescence are even more important to the development of the child. And again, Adolescence is going to be your time from the onset of puberty to the ending of puberty, whereas childhood is birth to the onset of puberty. So adolescence is a very, very, very important role, or a very important stage in a child's life, and the teachers play an extremely important role in fostering that love during adolescence.
Another way that we can help students while they go through puberty is by implementing what David Yeager calls social emotional learning programs for adolescents. These SELs seek to give adolescents the autonomy they desire while directing this autonomy towards healthy and positive outlets. One example Yeager discusses is teen outreach, an intervention designed to prevent teen pregnancy. The fascinating thing is that they barely even talk to the students about sex. They do not lecture them. They realize that, and this is the quote on the slide below, that adolescents might find it condescending to be given information they already have. For example, teens already know that smoking is harmful. Instead, they do service hours in their community and complete trainings on self-confidence and social skills. Teen outreach was successful in decreasing the percentage of teen pregnancies in a community. Similarly, Becoming a Man, or BAM, is a program aimed at decreasing youth violence. The adolescents were not lectured to on how violence is inappropriate or on how to stay out of trouble with the law. They know that violence should be avoided. Instead, they participated in group discussions about integrity, personal accountability, and ways other than violence to maintain their status when threatened. Boys even had to skip class to attend BAM, which was also appealing to them. BAM actually led to higher graduation rates, even though they were skipping class, and reduced arrests among participants by 28 to 35%, and reduced violent crime by 45 to 50%.
So as we finish up here, just wanted to give you a couple snapshots of what we've been talking about. Here are all of your wonderful presenters while they were undergoing adolescence and puberty. As always, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out during the conference. It has been so great to spend this time with you virtually. Thanks so much.